everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. The goal of this episode is something of a how-to guide of 10 things to do if you are being excommunicated, or I could add, if you fear you might be soon. So my story is I've been excommunicated or forced out of religious communities 3 times. You might be wondering why. I don't believe in the Trinity. This video really isn't specifically about the Trinity or not. This could be just something that's applicable to people in all sorts of different situations. And as I've been part of, online communities of people who also don't believe in the Trinity, I've heard lots of stories. Dozens or hundreds of stories. And as the host of this channel, many people reach out to me with stories, either stories that they're going through right now or things that have happened to them in the past. I would encourage you, if you feel so moved, to share part of your story that you so choose in the comments section. If you feel like giving some other encouragement to other people who might be clicking on this video. My goal is to share lessons from all of these stories and basically to try and give the lessons that I wish that someone had been there to tell me. So my first tip is pray. Take time to reflect. This can be a really difficult thing on your faith and relationship with God, to go through some sort of excommunication process. You really need to protect that at all costs, and keeping your prayer life active is really the best advice I can give to you for that. Ask God for guidance while you pray. Don't be scared to air your grievances with God either. Scripture is full of healthy examples of that. And ask God to give you advice. So my scripture passage for point number 1, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Point number 2, be prepared for this to hurt. Excommunication, or even the threat of it, can be extremely painful. We are social creatures made for community, and the threat of losing community and relationships can rank right up there with some of the most painful and traumatic experiences that humans can experience. Fear, embarrassment, shame, anger, insecurity, confusion, anxiety, moral disorientation are all likely and perfectly understandable reactions. This is heightened all the more in a religious setting because faith touches down to the deepest and most sensitive parts of us. In my experience, if you're already at the point of having clicked on this video, most scenarios that I've heard and seen don't tend to end well. But hopefully yours will be better than most that I've heard. Point number 3. Oh, wait a minute. I had a verse that I meant to read. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house. We walked in the throng. That's Psalm 55, 12 through 14. One of the hardest parts about going through an excommunication process can be when the people that you loved and cared about most deeply, that you shared your faith and your worship with, suddenly turn on you or have a very different opinion of you afterwards. That can be very painful. I feel like that verse in Psalm 55 describes that feeling. All right. Point number 3, ask yourself, what sort of communication is this? In my experience, there are really 2 or maybe 3 kinds of excommunications: behavioral or doctrinal. Behavioral is when you're being excommunicated for something that you did wrong, and doctrinal is when you're being excommunicated for not believing the right thing in the eyes of the church. These 2 can have big differences in how you should approach what's going on. You need to figure out what you are being accused of. Be clear to ask for this, especially in writing if you can. And then you need to reflect whether the accusations against you are true or false, or perhaps somewhere in between. If this is a behavioral excommunication and you are guilty, the good and bad news is that this is a relatively straightforward situation to deal with. Be prepared to be honest with yourselves and others about what you have done. Take accountability for what you've done, and seek for forgiveness and do your best to make amends. If you are being falsely accused, however, buckle up. If this is purely a doctrinal issue, this requires a completely different approach. I'll cover more of that in point number 8. There's also a third kind of excommunication, what I'll call a kangaroo trial excommunication. This is when you haven't done anything wrong, either behaviorally or doctrinally, but for reasons of internal church politics, toxic social dynamics, personal jealousy, power plays, or corruption, even, you're being pushed out of a church. If you're in that situation, my sincere apologies. Pay close attention to the upcoming points. Point number 4, you do not need to go through this alone. In my experience, after hearing many stories from others, it's highly likely the church will try and isolate you in this situation. They may do this consciously or unconsciously for a whole variety of reasons. They might not want you to influence anybody else. They might not want you to cause a scene. They might not want to scare anyone else in the church that this could happen to them. They might want to protect their own reputation. They might think that you'll be easier to deal with alone. For all these reasons and more, they'll likely try to isolate you. Even though this might be very embarrassing or shameful or difficult to talk about with other people, I highly encourage you to reach out to others. There is no commandment that you need to suffer through this by yourself. I'm being very clear and serious. This is perhaps the strongest thing that I'll recommend. Even if your pastor or church leaders tell you not to talk to anybody else, I really give you permission to not obey that request. I know that that's a strange thing to say to do, but I think it's completely unreasonable and unhealthy and potentially manipulative for them to ask you to go through this alone. You need to talk to people. And if they aren't letting you do that, then there's a really good chance they don't have your best interest in mind. Reach out to trusted friends and family. Sometimes it can be really helpful to reach out to people completely outside of your church who don't have a dog in the fight and can have an outsider's perspective. I'd also highly encourage you to reach out to friends in your church that are likely to be sympathetic to your situation and who care about you. Although I will say in situations like this, it often happens that you find who your true friends were, and sometimes you find people who you thought were your true friends that are willing to abandon you. And so just be prepared for that to happen. If this situation is particularly tense or high stakes, I also recommend you consider seeking legal counsel. Maybe not right away, as that could escalate the situation or sort of be a point of no return in the situation. But if you're an employee, a high ranking member of the church, or there's a job or reputation or money on the line, I do think it's completely appropriate to seek legal counsel. This is not the same as suing members of your church as described in 1 Corinthians. There's that passage in 1 Corinthians 6. When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare to go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat. For you, why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? The main context of this verse is that Paul is telling the Corinthian church that it is sort of embarrassing for the church to people to have like civil lawsuits like, oh, you loaned me $500 and you're not paying me back. I'm going to take you to court for you to pay me my $500 back. Paul's saying that it's embarrassing if the church can't handle those sorts of things themselves, and that there should be someone in the church who can judge fairly on behalf of such a case, and that it brings sort of shame and public embarrassment to the church to air your dirty laundry that way. But if the church is in a situation where there is no fair or just recourse for you, and that they are not listening, and that they are not seeking your good, and that there's no one to whom you can appeal, I don't think that Paul is saying here that means that you can't have a lawyer to try and protect yourself if the situation is unjust or corrupt. That's not the same thing as suing other people in your church. All right. Above reproach, you will be under intense scrutiny during this process. The leaders of your church will be looking for as many reasons as they can to excommunicate you once things have started down that road. The longer the list from their point of view, the easier the decision and the clearer their own conscience will be afterwards. In other words, it's likely that they will try and scapegoat you beyond whatever the initial offense might have been. You have to be very careful to be on your absolute best behavior and be beyond reproach in this situation. Love your enemies, pray for them, seek after peace and unity, handle everything with as much kindness and gentleness as you can. That's not the same thing as being a pushover, but keep your chin held high. As I've said, this is likely not to end well. And one of the few things that you have in your control is how you handle this whole situation. You'll want to look back at this experience with the perspective that you were proud of your own behavior and did everything you could as best as you could. Philippians 2:15, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. All right, point 6. Should I stay or should I go? Have an honest conversation with yourself and especially your family members, if relevant. Another point that I should make, if you're going through this, I would highly recommend, and you have family, either a spouse or children, or maybe you are a kid still living with your parents, do your best to maintain your relationship with your family members. Be honest with them, talk about it with them. Do your best to not let this be a wedge that comes between you and your family members. But in the question of should you stay or should you go, while I sincerely know that leaving can feel like admitting defeat or even guilt, sometimes it really is just the best option to pick your battles. If the church doesn't want you, or if you are at doctrinal odds with the church, as hard as it may be, even before the process has reached any formal conclusion or verdict, it might be best just to look for a different church home. It honestly bothers me to even give that advice because I've seen so many churches get away with such bad behavior for such a long time that it seems like voluntarily leaving just continues to allow them to get away with it, but it's often the best thing that you can do. However, if you decide to stay, this is going to be a difficult thing, but your example of trying to handle this process well can be an example that other people see and that can have a positive effect on the church or at least other people who are around. But it takes really a certain sort of person to be able to handle that. Point number 7, document everything. Encourage the communication that you have with your church to be written or recorded. People behave differently and often behave better if they know that someone else might listen or see it later. If you have just a verbal conversation, take notes afterwards and do your best to recall what was said. At the very least, this will be helpful for your own processing and your own understanding of events, as these sorts of things can be really confusing and disorienting. But if you're going to be under intense accusational pressure, having a good record of receipts is helpful. As I mentioned earlier, if this does come to legal proceedings, good records will be invaluable for you. The verse I have for this one: a single witness will not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. All right. Point number 8, shift the burden of proof. This is primarily advice for those facing a doctrinal excommunication. Many people in this situation feel that they need to create a completely persuasive knockout punch of a doctrinal presentation to immediately convince the pastor or elders or church members of your new doctrinal position. I hate to break it to you, I've heard hundreds of excommunication stories, and this basically never works. But my message is that you don't need to bear the burden of proof in this situation, even though it probably feels like you do. Ask the church leadership to help convince you of their position instead. This can help the church leadership stay in pastoring mode instead of inquisitor mode. It can lower the temperature in the room and help it stay productive. Say things like, I read this book or blog post or podcast, and I felt like it made some good points. If it's wrong, can we walk through it together and you could show me why it isn't correct? As opposed to saying, look how right this is and look how wrong you are. That's a way that will invite them to be more open and less defensive. This makes your job a lot easier too, and their job a little bit harder. This approach can diffuse the situation and perhaps prolong the process and give it more time for them to be sympathetic to you as a person, which could drastically change the outcome. And my verse for this one was Acts 17:11. Now these Jews, that is those in Berea, were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. You want the people in your church to be in Berea mode, not in Thessalonica mode when you are examining this question. All right, point number 9. Keep going to church. My second to last point is for what happens next. Christianity is not a solo sport. We can shoot hoops by ourselves for a while, but eventually you need to rejoin a team to really play. I know this is a really hard thing to ask. And like, I really feel the pain and difficulty of what I'm asking in this, but I would strongly encourage you, if you left the church, or even if you're going through the thick of the process still, keep going to church. Maybe afterwards you might need to take some time to regroup and look at your options, but don't let that take too long. If you are excommunicated or decided to voluntarily leave, try and find a church that more closely aligns with your beliefs. If you are unsure about a given church, reach out to the pastor or priest and ask to meet with them. In my experience, they almost always say yes to that sort of invitation. Tell your story, be upfront, be honest, and ask if this church will be willing to have you. Your interactions with that pastor will tell you a lot about whether it's a good church or whether you need to keep looking. And another reason to keep going to church, either during or afterwards, is that this helps you embrace the challenge of the situation on your own terms. It can be too easy to fall into the trap of fearing church and never wanting to go again. I certainly can relate to feeling that way. But by confronting your fears voluntarily, you take the initiative to not let that fear control you or define you. I strongly encourage you to not let the church that hurt you define your relationship to God or to other churches. Don't give them that power. Decide to keep going to church for yourself. And, well, actually, sorry, I forgot to read the verse again. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Point number 10. Jesus was excommunicated too. There's a silver lining in this whole process, and it's the opportunity to strengthen your relationship with Jesus Christ. Remember, Jesus was excommunicated from his religious community too and killed for his beliefs. I would strongly encourage you to reread the trial and crucifixion scenes at the end of each of the Gospels. I guarantee they will have a new resonance and leap off the page for you in a new way that they haven't before. This is an opportunity to grow in gratitude for what Jesus did for you and for you to experience a taste of what he went through on your behalf. Look to Jesus as your guide for how to handle this situation with grace. You are not going through this alone. Jesus is with you if you let him be. And he already went through what you're going through and worse. He can empathize you with and guide you. You do not need to do this by yourself. Here's a couple passages. Look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint hearted. Consider what Jesus went through and endured, so that you may not grow weary. Hebrews 13, the next chapter. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. And one last passage. For to this you have been called, because Jesus Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So remember, Jesus went through what you are going through now and worse, and he can help guide you and be an example. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful. If you want to email me, I'll put my email in the description. And like I said, feel free to leave a comment to help encourage others who might be going through something similar. Thank you all for listening.